They cut their way out of their own tent. 9 people, barely dressed, no shoes, and they ran straight into a blizzard at minus 30 degrees. Not one of them survived. When the rescue teams finally reached the mountain weeks later, what they found made no sense. Broken ribs, a missing tongue, skin that had turned orange, traces of radiation on the clothing, and a Soviet investigation that concluded with 5 words that have haunted researchers for over 6 decades: an unknown, compelling natural force. This is the full story of what happened on the Dyatlov Pass in February 1959. And I warn you now, the deeper you go into this case, the fewer answers you will find. To understand what happened on that mountain, you need to understand the world these 9 young people lived in. The Soviet Union in the late 1950s was a country of contradictions. It was launching satellites into space while millions of its citizens lived in communal apartments. It was testing hydrogen bombs in the Arctic while telling the world it wanted peace. And in the industrial cities of the Urals, a generation of young engineers and scientists was growing up believing they could conquer anything, including nature itself. Winter trekking was hugely popular among Soviet university students. It was cheap, it was physically demanding, and it carried a sense of romantic adventure that appealed to idealistic young people. The Communist Party encouraged it. Outdoor expeditions built character, discipline, and collective spirit. Universities had organized hiking clubs, and completing a difficult route earned you an official grade, much like a belt in martial arts. A Category 3 route was the highest and most dangerous classification. It meant remote wilderness, extreme cold, and weeks of complete self-reliance with no possibility of rescue if things went wrong. In January 1959, a group from the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk set out to complete exactly such a route. Their plan was to cross the northern Ural Mountains on skis, covering roughly 300 kilometers in about 3 weeks, and to summit a peak called Otorten. The name, in the language of the Mansi people indigenous to the region, is sometimes translated as "don't go there." Whether that translation is accurate, or simply a piece of dark folklore that attached itself to the story later, nobody can say for certain. But the name has become part of the legend. The leader of the expedition was Igor Alexeyevich Dyatlov. He was 23 years old, a 5th-year student in the radio engineering faculty. By all accounts, Igor was brilliant, serious, and deeply methodical. He built radios from scratch. He designed equipment for his expeditions. He had led multiple winter treks before, and he had a reputation for careful planning and sound judgment in the field. He was not the kind of person who took unnecessary risks, and the people who knew him later said the same thing over and over. If Igor made a decision on that mountain, it was because he believed it was the right one. He had assembled a team of 9, including himself. They were his friends, his classmates, people he trusted with his life, and every single one of them trusted him with theirs. The members of the group were as follows. Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, a cheerful and warm young woman studying radio engineering alongside Igor. Many of their friends believed she and Igor were quietly in love, though neither ever said so publicly. She kept a detailed diary during the trip, and her entries are some of the most valuable primary sources we have. Ludmila Dubinina, 21, was perhaps the toughest member of the group. Athletic, stubborn, and fiercely independent, she had already completed several difficult expeditions and had a reputation for never complaining, no matter how bad conditions got. Rustem Slobodin, 23, was an engineer who had recently graduated and begun working at a factory. Calm and thoughtful, he was known for his quiet reliability. Yuri Krivonishenko, 23, was the group's comedian. He played guitar, told jokes, and kept morale high even in the worst weather. He had worked at a secret nuclear facility called Chelyabinsk 40 after graduation, a detail that would later fuel some of the more exotic theories about the group's death. Yuri Doroshenko, 21, was the tallest and strongest in the group. He and Zina had dated briefly before the trip, and their complicated history added a layer of emotional tension that shows up occasionally in the diaries. Alexander Kolevatov, 24, was quiet, intellectual, and deeply private. He had transferred to the Ural Polytechnic from Moscow under circumstances that were never fully explained, and some researchers have speculated that he had connections to Soviet security services, though no hard evidence supports this. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, 23, had a French surname that made him stand out. His grandfather had emigrated to Russia from France, and Nikolai was proud of his unusual heritage. He was passionate about mountaineering and was known for his physical endurance. And then, there was Alexander Zolotaryov. At 37, he was significantly older than the rest of the group. A World War II veteran who had fought from Stalingrad to the gates of Berlin, he was a qualified sports instructor working at a tourism base in the Urals. He had joined the expedition at the last minute, reportedly at the recommendation of a mutual acquaintance. Some members of the group did not know him well. His presence has always been one of the more puzzling elements of the story. Why would a 37-year-old war veteran with his own career and qualifications want to join a student ski trek? Some say he simply loved the mountains. Others have suggested darker reasons. We will come back to Zolotaryov later, because the circumstances surrounding his body are among the strangest in the entire case. The 10th and final member of the original group was Yuri Yudin. And Yuri Yudin is the reason we know as much as we do about the first days of this expedition. He is also the only person who walked into that wilderness and walked back out alive. On January 23, 1959, the group boarded a train in Sverdlovsk, heading north. Photographs from that day show them laughing, singing, clowning around in the railcar. They looked like what they were, young, confident, excited. The train took them to the city of Serov, and from there they traveled by bus and then by truck to a small settlement called Vizhai, the last inhabited place before the wilderness. They spent a night there, repacked their supplies, and on January 27th, they set off on skis into the forest. The weather was cold but manageable. The snow was deep. They made reasonable progress, following a route along the Lozva River and then turning northwest toward the mountains. Their diaries from these days describe ordinary expedition hardships: wet socks, heavy backpacks, arguments about the best route, Krivonishenko making everyone laugh, Dubinina refusing to admit she was tired. Normal things, human things. On January 28th, Yuri Yudin's chronic joint pain flared up so badly that he could not continue. The decision was difficult but necessary. He would turn back, and the remaining 9 would go on without him. There's a famous photograph from that moment. It shows Yudin embracing Dubinina in a farewell hug. Both are smiling. Behind them, the winter forest stretches out in every direction. It is the last image of the group together. Yudin returned to Vizhai and then to Sverdlovsk. He would spend the next 54 years, until his death in 2013, wondering why fate had spared him and not the others. In interviews, he often said the same thing. He felt guilty for surviving, and he never stopped thinking about his friends. The remaining 9 pushed deeper into the wilderness. On January 31st, they cached surplus food and equipment in a forest valley, creating a supply depot for their return journey. This was standard practice. Then they began their ascent toward the highland ridge. The trees grew thinner. The wind grew stronger. The landscape changed from dense taiga forest to bare, exposed mountain tundra. On February 1st, they attempted to push toward Otorten, but were hit by deteriorating weather. Strong winds, heavy snowfall, and poor visibility forced them to change course. Rather than retreat to the tree line and camp in the relative shelter of the forest, Igor Dyatlov made the decision to pitch their tent on the open slope of a mountain called Kholat Syakhl. In the Mansi language, this means dead mountain. It was not an irrational decision. They were experienced. The tent was sturdy. They had weathered storms before. Setting up camp on the slope meant they would not lose altitude and could resume their push toward Otorten in the morning. It was a calculated choice, but it was the last choice any of them would ever make. They dug a platform in the snow, erected the tent, and settled in for the night. Their last diary entries and the final photograph taken inside the tent suggest a normal evening. They ate dinner. They were probably tired. The wind outside was brutal, but inside the tent, with 9 bodies generating warmth and the walls blocking the worst of the gale, conditions were survivable. Sometime around 8 or 9 in the evening, they probably began to sleep. And then something happened. Whatever occurred inside or outside that tent between 9 in the evening and the early hours of February 2nd, it was so frightening, so immediate, and so overwhelming that 9 rational, experienced people chose to abandon their only shelter and flee into a lethal blizzard, wearing almost nothing. They did not stop to put on boots. They did not grab their coats. They did not take food, matches, or any of the survival equipment that was carefully packed inside the tent. Instead, someone took a knife and slashed the tent wall open from the inside, cutting multiple long gashes through the heavy canvas, and the entire group poured out into the night. The temperature outside was approximately -25 to -30 degrees Celsius. The wind was strong enough to knock a person off balance. Visibility was near zero. Under these conditions, an unprotected human body begins to lose core temperature within minutes. Frostbite sets in quickly. Death from hypothermia can follow in as little as 1 to 2 hours, depending on exertion and exposure. Every person in that group knew this. They had trained for exactly these conditions, and yet, they ran. Nobody came looking for them right away. The group had been expected to send a telegram from Vizhai upon their return around February 12th. When no telegram arrived, there was initial concern but no alarm. Delays on winter expeditions were common. It was not until February 20th that the first search parties were organized, composed of fellow students and faculty from the Polytechnic Institute. When those initial searches found nothing, the military was called in. Helicopters, soldiers, tracking dogs. The search expanded rapidly across a vast area of frozen wilderness. On February 26th, a search team found the tent. It was partially collapsed and covered in a layer of wind-driven snow, but it was clearly visible on the open slope. The cuts in the canvas were immediately obvious. Inside, the searchers found the group's belongings neatly arranged. Boots were lined up along the inner wall. Jackets and warm clothing were folded or hung. Food supplies were intact. The stove had been disassembled for the night and not relit. Everything suggested a sudden, unplanned departure. There was no sign of a struggle inside the tent. No blood. No indication that anyone had been attacked or injured before they left. Whatever drove them out had come quickly, and it had affected all 9 of them simultaneously. From the tent, investigators found tracks leading down the slope toward the northeast, in the direction of the tree line roughly 1.5 kilometers away. The tracks were remarkably well preserved in the compacted snow. They showed that the group had moved in a relatively organized fashion at first, walking close together in 2 or 3 parallel columns. Some prints were bare feet, others showed wool socks. 1 or 2 showed a single shoe or boot, as if the person had managed to grab only one before fleeing. As the tracks descended the slope, they gradually converged into a single line, and then, where the snow became softer near the edge of the forest, they vanished entirely. The first 2 bodies were found on February 27th, near a large cedar tree at the edge of the forest, approximately 1.5 kilometers from the tent. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko lay in the snow next to the remains of a small fire. They were wearing only underwear. Their feet were bare. Their hands were badly torn, with skin ripped from the fingers and embedded under the fingernails. The branches of the cedar tree were broken off to a height of roughly 5 meters, and there were traces of skin and blood on the bark. One or both of them had climbed the tree, desperately, using their bare hands in the freezing cold. Why would a dying man climb a tree? Some investigators believe they were trying to see the tent, hoping to determine if it was safe to return. Others think they may have been trying to break off branches to feed the fire. The fire itself was small, pitifully small given the conditions, and it had clearly burned for only a short time before going out. Pieces of clothing found near the fire suggested that someone had tried to burn garments for warmth, a sign of absolute desperation. The medical examiner determined that both men died of hypothermia. 3 more bodies were found over the following days, scattered along the slope between the cedar tree and the tent. Igor Dyatlov was found roughly 300 meters uphill from the cedar, lying on his back with one arm raised, as if he had been trying to shield his face from the wind. He was wearing a shirt, underwear, and 1 sock. No shoes, no coat. His expression, according to those who found him, was calm. Zenaida Kolmogorova was found further up the slope, about 800 meters from the cedar. She had made it farther than almost anyone, climbing back toward the tent despite the cold and wind. Her body was found in a dynamic pose, as if she had been crawling uphill when she died. She wore slightly more clothing than the others, a hat, 2 shirts and trousers, but still no shoes. Rustem Slobodin was found between Dyatlov and Kolmogorova. He was wearing 1 boot on his right foot. His left foot was bare. The autopsy revealed a small fracture in his skull, though the medical examiner concluded it was not fatal on its own, and that Slobodin had also died of hypothermia. All 5 of these victims shared a similar profile. Their injuries were consistent with cold exposure, minor bruises, abrasions, and frostbite. The official cause of death for each was hypothermia. Terrible but not mysterious. People who freeze to death in the wilderness often behave irrationally in their final hours. They undress themselves, a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing, caused by a malfunction in the body's temperature regulation as hypothermia progresses. They wander, they climb, they stop making sense. What happened to these 5 was tragic but medically explicable. But the other 4 were different, and it is the other 4 that turned this case from a sad mountaineering accident into one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. The bodies of Ludmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Alexander Zolotaryov were not found until May 4, 1959, more than 2 months after the first 5. They lay in a ravine roughly 75 meters from the cedar tree, buried under 4 meters of snow. A small stream ran beneath the snowpack. The discovery was made only after the spring thaw began to expose pieces of clothing on the surface. When the rescuers dug down and extracted the bodies, they immediately knew that something very different had happened to these 4. Dubinina had massive bilateral fractures of the ribs on both sides of her chest. Her ribcage had been crushed inward with tremendous force. She also had extensive bleeding in the heart area, and her tongue, the floor of her mouth, and part of her upper lip were missing. The soft tissue had been removed, but there were no external wounds to explain how. Thibault-Brignol had a catastrophic skull fracture. The temporal bone on the right side of his head was shattered, with fragments driven inward into the brain. The force required to produce this injury was compared by the forensic examiner to being hit by a car. Zolotaryov had crushed ribs similar to Dubinina's, with the damage concentrated on the right side of his chest. He also had his eyes missing. Kolevatov's body showed less dramatic external injuries, but had signs of severe trauma consistent with the conditions in the ravine. The critical detail that baffled investigators was this. The massive chest and skull injuries showed no corresponding external wounds. There were no bruises, no broken skin, no marks on the outside of the bodies that matched the devastation inside. Whatever crushed their chests and shattered Thibault-Brignol's skull had done so without leaving a visible mark on the surface. The forensic examiner, a man named Boris Vozrojdeny, stated in his official report that the injuries could not have been caused by another human being. The force required was simply too great. He compared the compression injuries to those seen in victims of high-speed car accidents or people caught in bomb blasts. This was not a beating. This was not a fight. Something with immense, non-human force had struck these people. As for Dubinina's missing tongue and soft tissue, the explanation remains disputed. Some researchers believe it was the result of natural decomposition and scavenging by small animals or aquatic organisms in the stream that ran beneath the snow. The mouth, tongue, and eyes are among the first soft tissues to decompose, and scavengers target them preferentially. This is a well-documented phenomenon. Others find this explanation insufficient, pointing to the apparently clean removal of the tissue and the absence of similar damage on other bodies that were also exposed to the elements for weeks. There was one more anomaly. When investigators tested the clothing of the victims, several items worn by Kolevatov, Dubinina, and Zolotaryov showed elevated levels of radioactive contamination. Not dangerously high, but significantly above normal background levels. The source of this contamination was never identified. The investigator in charge, a young prosecutor named Lev Ivanov, noted the radioactivity in his files, but was reportedly told by his superiors not to pursue that line of inquiry. The Soviet criminal investigation into the deaths of the Dyatlov group was opened in February 1959 and closed in May of the same year. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, was a relatively junior prosecutor who later admitted that he had been under significant pressure from regional and possibly federal authorities throughout the process. The final verdict was brief and unsatisfying. The hikers had died as a result of a spontaneous force which they were not able to overcome. No criminal charges were filed. No specific cause was identified. The case files were classified and placed in restricted archives, where they remained inaccessible to the public for over 30 years. This secrecy, more than anything else, is what transformed the Dyatlov Pass incident from a tragic accident into an enduring mystery. If the explanation was simple, why classify the files? If it was just a group of hikers who made a fatal mistake in bad weather, why would the Soviet government care enough to seal the records? The closure of the case did not stop people from asking questions. On the contrary, it ensured that the questions would multiply for decades. Let us examine the main theories that have been proposed over the years. The simplest and most widely accepted explanation among modern researchers is an avalanche. The logic is straightforward. The group camped on a snow-covered slope. During the night, a slab of snow broke loose above the tent and either struck the tent directly or produced a terrifying rumble and vibration that convinced the hikers an avalanche was imminent. In a state of panic, they cut their way out and ran downhill, which is exactly the wrong thing to do in an avalanche, but exactly what frightened people do instinctively. Once they were outside in the lethal cold without proper clothing, their fate was sealed. The chest and skull injuries in the ravine group could have been caused by the weight of the snow as it collapsed into the ravine where they had taken shelter. This theory received significant support in January 2021, when researchers from Switzerland published a study in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment, using advanced snow simulation models to demonstrate that the specific conditions on the slope that night, the angle, the wind loading pattern, the cut the hikers had made into the snow to create their tent platform, could indeed have triggered a small, delayed slab avalanche. The study showed that a relatively compact block of snow could have struck the tent with enough force to cause the observed injuries without necessarily burying the entire site. When the search team arrived weeks later, wind and fresh snowfall could have erased all visible traces of the avalanche. This theory is elegant and requires no exotic explanations. Many experts consider the case essentially solved. But not everyone is convinced. The avalanche theory has several persistent weaknesses. First, the slope angle at the campsite was measured at between 15 and 23 degrees. While slab avalanches can occur at these angles, they are uncommon. The typical danger zone for slab avalanches is between 30 and 45 degrees. Second, the search teams who reached the tent found the tent only partially collapsed and still anchored by its poles. A slab avalanche powerful enough to crush ribcages would likely have flattened the tent entirely and displaced it downhill. Third, the footprints leading away from the tent were orderly and well preserved, showing people walking, not running in chaotic panic from a wall of snow. If a slab had just hit the tent, you would expect some of the prints to be obscured or buried. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, the group did not behave as if they feared a second avalanche. They walked directly downhill, staying on the open slope for over a kilometer before reaching the trees. Experienced hikers who had just survived an avalanche would know that descending directly below the fracture zone is extremely dangerous. They would have traversed laterally to get off the avalanche path. Instead, they moved in a straight line down the fall line, as if the threat they were fleeing was not above them on the slope, but something else entirely. These objections do not disprove the avalanche theory, but they have kept the debate alive. The second major theory involves the indigenous Mansi people. The Mansi had lived in the northern Urals for centuries and considered certain mountains sacred. Kholat-Syakhl was within their traditional territory, and some investigators initially suspected that the hikers had trespassed on a sacred site and been attacked by Mansi hunters. This theory was taken seriously enough that several Mansi men were interrogated during the original investigation. However, it was quickly abandoned. The Mansi had no history of violence against outsiders. The injuries found on the bodies were inconsistent with any known weapon, and the Mansi themselves were genuinely bewildered by the suggestion. They pointed out, reasonably, that if they had wanted to harm the hikers, They would not have done so on their own sacred ground, which they believed would bring spiritual contamination. The forensic evidence also ruled out human attackers. No foreign footprints were found near the tent, no signs of a struggle. And the crushing injuries, as the medical examiner stated, exceeded the force any human could deliver with hands, fists, or simple weapons. The third theory is military involvement. This is where the story gets darker and more complicated. The northern Urals in 1959 were not as empty as they appeared. The Soviet military used vast stretches of remote territory for weapons testing, including ballistic missiles, atmospheric nuclear detonations, and experimental ordnance. The Baikonur Cosmodrome launched rockets on trajectories that passed over the Ural region. The Novaya Zemlya nuclear test site was located to the far north but was part of the same military infrastructure. Several witnesses in the Dyatlov case reported seeing strange orange spheres in the sky over the northern Urals on the nights surrounding February 1st and 2nd. These reports came from multiple independent sources, including other hikers, Mansi hunters, and military personnel. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, took these reports seriously and included them in the case file. Decades later, in 1990, Ivanov gave an interview in which he said he had always believed the deaths were connected to some kind of military testing, possibly involving rockets or experimental weapons. He said he had been explicitly ordered by his superiors to close the investigation and to remove any references to the glowing spheres from the official conclusions. He also said the radioactive contamination found on the clothing had never been adequately explained by natural causes. Ivanov did not claim to know exactly what weapon or test had killed the group, but he was convinced that the Soviet military was involved and that the government had covered up the truth. His testimony is among the most compelling pieces of circumstantial evidence in the entire case. What kind of military activity could explain the evidence? Several possibilities have been proposed. One is that the group was caught in the blast zone of a parachute-deployed test weapon, possibly a fuel-air explosive or a concussive device. Fuel-air explosives, sometimes called vacuum bombs, generate a massive pressure wave that can crush internal organs and bones without leaving the kind of penetrating wounds associated with shrapnel or bullets. This would be consistent with the internal injuries found on the ravine floor. The pressure wave could also explain the tent being damaged and the hikers' panicked evacuation. The radioactive contamination could have come from radiological materials used in the warhead or from fallout carried on the wind from a separate nuclear test. Another military hypothesis involves rocket fuel. If a rocket stage or missile had malfunctioned and fallen in the area, it could have released toxic propellant, specifically unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine, which is a highly toxic compound used in Soviet ballistic missiles. Exposure to the fumes could have caused the group to panic, slash the tent for ventilation or escape, and flee into the night. Prolonged exposure can cause disorientation, tissue damage, and death. However, toxicology reports from the autopsies did not specifically test for rocket fuel compounds, and the original tissue samples were not preserved in a way that would allow modern retesting. There is also the question of Zolotaryov. Remember, he was the outsider. 37 years old, a war veteran, a man with a somewhat murky background. Some researchers have speculated that Zolotaryov was not simply a sports instructor who wanted to join a student trek. They suggest he may have been a KGB informant or operative tasked with observing something in the northern Urals, perhaps monitoring military activity, checking on reports from the Mansi, or even photographing a scheduled test. His camera was found with him in the ravine, but the film was reportedly too damaged to develop, or so the official report claimed. If Zolotaryov had a covert purpose on the expedition, it could explain both his unexpected presence and the government's eagerness to shut down the investigation. This remains entirely speculative. No documentary evidence has surfaced linking Zolotaryov to any intelligence agency. But the theory persists because it neatly explains several otherwise puzzling aspects of the case. Beyond the avalanche, Mansi, and military theories, the Dyatlov case has generated a vast ecosystem of alternative explanations, ranging from the scientifically plausible to the wildly fantastical. Some deserve serious consideration. Others tell us more about human psychology than about what happened on that mountain. One of the more interesting scientific hypotheses involves infrasound. When strong winds flow over mountain ridges and irregular terrain features, they can generate very low-frequency sound waves below the threshold of human hearing. These infrasound waves, typically in the range of 1 to 20 hertz, have been shown in laboratory studies to cause feelings of unease, anxiety, disorientation, and even outright panic in human subjects. Some researchers have proposed that the specific topography of Kholat Syakhl, combined with the extreme wind conditions on the night of February 1st, could have created a powerful infrasound effect known as a Kármán vortex street. This occurs when wind flows around an obstacle and creates repeating vortices on the leeward side, generating a pulsing, low-frequency pressure wave. If the tent was positioned in the path of such a wave, the occupants could have experienced sudden, overwhelming terror without understanding its source. They would have felt a desperate need to escape the tent, even though there was no visible threat. This would explain the panicked departure, the slashing of the tent fabric, and the failure to take survival equipment. Once outside, the effect would have diminished, but by then they were already exposed to lethal cold. The infrasound theory is elegant because it requires no conspiracy, no military involvement, and no exotic phenomena. It relies on known physics and documented human responses to low-frequency sound. Its weakness is that it cannot easily account for the catastrophic injuries found on the Ravine 4. Infrasound can cause panic, but it does not crush ribcages. Another theory that has gained traction in recent years involves a combination of factors rather than a single cause. According to this view, the initial evacuation was caused by one threat, perhaps a small avalanche, a snow collapse on the tent, or even infrasound, and the severe injuries were caused by a separate event that occurred later, after the group had split up. Those who descended to the ravine may have fallen through a snow bridge into a deeper crevice, where the collapse of snow above them caused the compression injuries. This two-stage theory resolves many of the contradictions in the evidence. It explains why the first 5 victims died of simple hypothermia, while the Ravine 4 suffered catastrophic trauma. It explains why the group left the tent in panic, but then moved in a relatively orderly fashion once they were outside. And it explains why the Ravine 4 were found buried under 4 meters of snow in a location that suggests they were seeking shelter rather than fleeing in random panic. The problem with multi-factor theories is that they are hard to prove or disprove. The more variables you introduce, the more flexible the explanation becomes, and the easier it is to fit the evidence to any desired conclusion. Then, there are the theories that venture beyond conventional explanation. Some researchers have pointed to the reports of glowing orange spheres and suggested UFO involvement. Others have proposed that the group encountered an escaped prisoner or a wild animal, though neither hypothesis fits the physical evidence. A few have even suggested that the group was the victim of a secret Soviet experiment involving psychoactive weapons or mind control technology. These theories have little evidentiary support, but they have enormous popular appeal, which is why the Dyatlov Pass has become one of the most famous mysteries in the world. In 2019, 60 years after the incident, the Russian Prosecutor General's office announced that it was reopening the investigation. This generated worldwide media attention and raised hopes that modern forensic techniques might finally resolve the case. The investigation team revisited the site, consulted with avalanche experts, and reviewed the original evidence. In July 2020, they announced their conclusions. The cause of death was an avalanche. Specifically, they determined that a slab avalanche had struck the tent, injuring some of the hikers, and that the survivors had evacuated and attempted to reach the forest for shelter. Unable to return to the tent due to poor visibility and disorientation, they succumbed to hypothermia. The Ravine 4 had been further injured when the snow beneath them collapsed into the stream bed. "Case closed," said the prosecutors. "Nature killed them." The reaction was mixed. Many researchers accepted the finding as reasonable, especially in light of the Swiss simulation study published shortly afterward. The avalanche theory had always been the most parsimonious explanation, and having it endorsed by an official investigation with modern tools gave it significant credibility. But critics pointed out that the reopened investigation had a narrow mandate. The prosecutors had announced at the outset that they were only considering three natural hypotheses: avalanche, hurricane-force winds, or a snow slab. Military involvement, government cover-up, and all other non-natural explanations were excluded from the scope of the investigation before it even began. This predetermined framing meant that no matter what the evidence showed, the conclusion would always be a natural phenomenon. To many observers, this looked less like a genuine search for truth and more like a government attempt to put a persistent and embarrassing mystery to rest. Yuri Kuntsevich, the head of the Dyatlov Foundation and a longtime advocate for full transparency, expressed disappointment. He noted that the prosecutors had not addressed the radioactive contamination, had not explained the military witnesses who reported seeing glowing objects in the sky, and had not accounted for Lev Ivanov's testimony about being ordered to shut down the investigation. Kuntsevich died in 2020, still believing that the full truth had not been told. And this is the heart of the problem. The Dyatlov Pass incident exists in a space between what can be proven and what can be known. The physical evidence is fragmentary, degraded by time, weather, and the limitations of 1950s forensic science. The Soviet government's handling of the case, the classification of files, the pressure on investigators, the narrow scope of the reopened inquiry, all of this has created a permanent shadow of doubt that no official conclusion can fully dispel. Even if the avalanche theory is correct, the cover-up was real. Something about this case made the Soviet authorities uncomfortable enough to classify the files for 3 decades. Maybe it was the radioactivity. Maybe it was the military tests in the area. Maybe it was simply bureaucratic caution in a paranoid state. But the secrecy guaranteed that the Dyatlov Pass would never be just a hiking accident. It became a mirror, reflecting back whatever fears and suspicions each generation brought to it. I want to return now to the human beings at the center of this story, because it is easy to lose them in the theories and the evidence and the endless debate. They were not mysteries, they were people. Igor Dyatlov never finished his degree. He never built the radios he dreamed of building. He never married. He was 23. Zina Kolmogorova wrote in her diary about the beauty of the snow-covered forest, about cooking dinner in the tent while the wind howled outside, about laughing at Krivonishenko's terrible jokes. She was 22. Ludmila Dubinina, the toughest of them all, wrote about her frustration with the heavy packs and her determination to keep going no matter what. She was 21. Yuri Krivonishenko, who made everyone laugh, who played guitar around the campfire, who had worked at a secret nuclear plant and carried traces of that work on his clothes and perhaps in his cells. He was 23. Yuri Doroshenko, the tallest, the strongest, who climbed a tree with his bare hands in the freezing dark, tearing his own skin away in the effort to survive or to see a way home. He was 21. Rustem Slobodin, quiet and reliable, who managed to put on a single boot before fleeing the tent, and who walked into the wind until his body could not carry him any farther. He was 23. Alexander Kolevatov, the intellectual, the private one, whose transfer from Moscow was never explained, and whose calm demeanor masked depths that his friends could only guess at. He was 24. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, proud of his French name, passionate about the mountains, who suffered the most violent death of all when something shattered his skull on a frozen night 2,000 kilometers from anywhere. He was 23. And Alexander Zolotaryov, the enigma, the veteran, the outsider who joined at the last minute and who was found dead with a camera around his neck and his ribs crushed inward. Whatever secrets he carried, if he carried any, died with him in that ravine. He was 37. And finally, Yuri Yudin, the one who turned back, the one whose aching joints saved his life and condemned him to a lifetime of grief and unanswered questions. In 2008, 50 years after the tragedy, Yudin was interviewed for a documentary. He was an old man by then, white-haired and fragile. He held up a photograph of the group taken in the first days of the trek. His hands trembled as he pointed to each face. He could still name everyone. He still remembered every detail of the days they spent together before he turned back. He still could not explain what happened to his friends. If I had not gotten sick, he said, I would have died with them. And part of me did. Ural died on April 27, 2013. He was 75 years old. He had asked to be buried next to his friends. So what really happened on the Dyatlov Pass? After everything we have examined, after all the evidence and theories and testimonies, the honest answer is that we do not know. We may never know. And perhaps that is the most important thing to understand about this case. The Dyatlov Pass incident is not a puzzle with a missing piece that someone will eventually find. It is a wound in the historical record, a place where the evidence runs out and the silence begins. We know 9 people died. We know how they died, at least in medical terms. We know where they died. But we do not know why. We do not know what made them cut open their tent and walk into certain death. We do not know what crushed 4 of their chests and skulls with the force of an automobile collision without leaving a mark on their skin. We do not know why their clothing was radioactive. We do not know what glowed orange in the sky above the Urals that night. And we do not know why the Soviet government considered this hiking accident important enough to classify for 30 years. What we do know is this. 9 young people went into the mountains because they loved the mountains. They were smart, strong, and brave. They trusted each other. They trusted their leader. And when the worst came, whatever the worst was, they faced it together. The evidence suggests that even in their final hours, they tried to help each other. Some of the Ravine 4 were wearing clothing taken from the bodies of Doroshenko and Krivonishenko, who had died first near the cedar tree. This means the survivors went to their dead friends, removed their clothes, and redistributed them among the living to help them survive longer. Even when everything was lost, they did not abandon each other. There is something in that fact that transcends the mystery, something that no theory can explain away or diminish. They died together on a frozen mountain in the middle of nowhere, and they died trying to keep each other alive. The mountain is still there. Kholat Syakhl, Dead Mountain. The wind still howls across its barren slope in winter, carrying snow and ice at speeds that can strip exposed skin in seconds. The pass where the group camped has been officially renamed Dyatlov Pass in their memory. A small memorial plaque was placed at the site years ago. Hikers still visit. They leave flowers. They leave notes. They take photographs of the empty landscape and try to imagine what it was like on that night in February 1959. The mountain does not answer. It never does. 9 people went into the wilderness. None of them came back. And after 65 years, the Urals are still keeping their secret.